in terms of monism, the idea that all reality is one kind of being, and it's all really just a pyramid. This is why all the ancient cultures have ziggurats and they have pyramids. Okay, it's not because the alien gods were teaching them how to make spaceships. It was because they had a philosophy. Now, they might have been interacting with demons. I'm not saying that's not true, but because they did do all kinds of rituals that involved drug use and then involved human sacrifice and occult traditions and so forth. And so if they were bombed out of their mind on drugs and going into altered states of consciousness, that would be my view of how they contacted the spirit realm or the realm of the demonic. We don't know exactly how in the ancient world the celestial intelligences interacted with those cultures. We just don't know. We have statements in Genesis and Book of Enoch that do seem to give indicators, but again, we just don't have a lot of certitude about these things, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with saying you don't know, and it's actually a much better position than the stupidity of the establishment, which constantly contradicts itself in its radical quest to always play the confidence game of pretending that they actually do know, that they have this sort of infallible certainty about all this stuff when they don't. Now, so again, that same pattern, what I was getting at is that all being, all reality, all what is in these ancient cultures, and I'm going to say, I made the radical claim that yes, aside from the biblical view, and in fact, I've read more than one secular scholar. There's a book on the history of human sacrifice that I cited in my book, Esoteric Hollywood. I can't remember the guy's name off the top of my head, but it's cited in there. It's on human sacrifice, and he admits that the Jews, the Jewish prophets, and he's not a Jew, he's not interested in biblical theology, he's not Christian or anything like that. He admits that the Jews were the only culture in the ancient world that didn't, or that fought against, or at least preached against, this tendency to sacrifice people and build giant ziggurats and kill firstborn and stuff like this, right? So you'll have to find that quote later. Again, it's in my book. Just look up the human sacrifice thing in Esoteric Hollywood. You'll find that guy's book where he talks about that. But I think I even quote that section in my book. But yes, since the world again presents predators and prey, this is another reason why you would get the elites in these different pagan cultures, claiming to be the God people. This was a great insight that Jamie actually had in her book. I think it's either in Operation Culture Creation or Hollywood Mind Control. Maybe it's Operation Culture Creation. There's a section where she talks about the ancient cultures, and the reason they worship fire is because fire would ward off predators in the night, right? So, yeah, okay, you could kind of see why they would deify the thing that's scaring off lions and the tigers and the bears. But then the elite, or the oligarchic class, saw this and they realized, so what do men fear? Well, they fear the nature spirits. They fear the primeval lion, tiger, and bear that's going to come get you. So we could weaponize that, and then we take on the characteristics of lion, tiger, bear, predator, right? In our artwork, in our iconography, you'll see the elites mixed with animal creatures and so forth, and this is the gods. And so what do the prey? What does the king of the jungle do? Well, he eats the weaker ones. So how do we maintain our elite status? Well, we eat and sacrifice the plebes. So we were talking about Egypt. I wanted to do a little bit more about Egypt. the common man, as we said, was at the bottom of that pyramid, Pharaoh at the top. And if you've ever wondered why Pharaoh shaved his head, why he had that gold dome, it was because, well, excuse me, the cue ball dome and the golden necklace is because he's reflecting the sun, right? So he is the mediator between heaven and earth. And then the state, as we said,
iPhone disconnected.
The desire of Pharaoh, basically, who is the image of the sun god. And so when we read Exodus, you read through Exodus, say the first 10 or 11 chapters, you'll see that Moses there is mocking the Egyptian system of thought and esotericism, and we know, as Exodus says, Moses learned all the mysteries of Egypt. He's making fun of that, and the system is being dismantled through all of the different plagues. So each one of those plagues from Moses is actually an attack on a specific Egyptian deity, right? The frogs, Kek, I guess, or the Nile god and so forth, with the blood in the Nile turning to blood. So Moses is mocking Egypt's system as he does each one of the plagues, as he pronounces the curses. So this turns all their gods into foolishness, basically. It's a form of spiritual warfare, apologetic attack. And what we see then is that from this principle that the futility of man's worldviews and man's autonomously, secularly, esoterically created systems are mocked. They're foolishness. And this is really the pattern that you see throughout the Mediterranean powers, back to the Hittites, the Jebusites, and all these different ancient cultures that are mentioned, for example, in the historical texts of Samuel or Chronicles or Kings. And so, as we said, philosophy doesn't begin in Greece. It goes back to the ancient Mediterranean powers, and philosophy, quote unquote, back then, as we mentioned in hour one, was tied into the indigenous religious thought. So the indigenous religious thought included Baalism and the worship of the principles of nature through Baal, a fertility cult, and this was especially prominent amongst the Amorites. So fertility, because it was needed as part of life, you need to reproduce, create offspring. The principles, the generative principles, become worshipped, right? And this passes into things like masonry, right? The G, the generative principle, the great architect, gnosis, etc. This is what masonry is sort of based around as well. So masonry, you could call it the kind of the Philistinism of our day. The Philistines had another culture had developed a lot of tools and weapons of warfare, is what they were known for. And they connected, obviously the warfare was connected to the gods. And, when you went into battle, there's this intimate connection between, the idea is that your gods are battling their gods, and the humans are kind of the earthly forces of the gods. This comes up many times in the Bible, for example. So the Philistines, as I said, had developed a lot of iron tools, and they were known for this technology of warfare. In Phrygia, the idea was that revolution was the form of salvation. So the Phrygian hat, right, I guess it goes back to this. And so they would overturn the political order, and this was seen as a kind of new order instituted, a revolutionary order was instituted. And this becomes the principle for all revolutionary thought. So there was a couple gods that were worshipped back in the Mediterranean period that stand out. Ashtaroth, and these are exaggerated female and male genitalia, the Asherim and the Ashtaroth. And so sex in these ancient cults was sex magic. It was exalted to a form of ritual worship. And that's why the modern sex cults just rehash this, is because really there's nothing new under the sun. They're just reinvigorating the ancient principles of nature worship and generative principles being reenacted through ritual liturgical ceremonies. And again, we see this today, right? Sex cults, eyes wide shut type stuff. So Assyria and Babylon stand out as two ancient cultures, civilizations. 10 tribes went into of Judah. 10 tribes of Israel went into captivity in Syria in the Old Testament. Judah and Benjamin went into Babylonian captivity. And so what's the overriding philosophy of this period back then? Political might makes right. The emperor is the law. He's the incarnation of the God principle. He's the God person. And this continues, of course, all the way into the Roman Imperium, right? So one of the interesting aspects of Jewish law, or the revelation to the law to the prophets, Moses and so forth, is a new idea that law is objective. It's not at the whim of Pharaoh. It's not based on might makes right. It's based on objectivity. It's based on natural law. It's based on principles in objective reality that are not subject to human alteration. That's one of the new ideas, what's one of the unique ideas of this religion. So the religious aspect and thought of these ancient cultures of, say, Assyria or Babylon, they were characterized by a kind of despair and cynicism, right? And that makes sense, because if might makes right, then it seems to follow that, unless you're Pharaoh or the God people at the palace, your life pretty much has no meaning. And this tends to be the norm across cultures, right? With the Chinese emperor, if you're one of the plebes, if you're one of the peasants, you're just a drop in the ocean, and the ocean is incarnated in the form of the emperor, right? And you can't even look at the emperor if you're a peasant. You dare not look upon him, right? Like Hillary telling the staffers not to even look at her. So, and it stands to reason that these ancient cultures then were led to the conclusion that the only way to make sense of the world is to have a world government. As we said, all of these empires strove for global domination. One world government was the goal. And the Babylonian priests and the Assyrian priests, they were very focused, especially Babylon, the Chaldeans, were very focused on astrology. So the worship of the heavenly luminaries as if they determine the events on earth, right? Which ultimately is fate and denies responsibility and volition and free will to man, is actually a very imprisoning, destructive, confining system. We don't want to be confined to the determining principles of nature and the phenomena of, the planets and tides and this kind of stuff. That we're not predestined by those things. Nature does not determine us. In Persia, the dominant religion was Zoroastrianism, as we know. Darius in the Bible is called the Anointed One because God is able even to use Darius the emperor, Persian emperor, for the purposes of God. And so once again, even in Persia, we see the influence of Jewish thought. I know that this is oftentimes characterized as the other way around. Oh, the Talmud shows that the Jews borrowed everything from the Persians, but we don't actually know exactly the interchange there. And as we said, with Joseph in Egypt, it could very well be the other way around. So Darius is called, as we said in Isaiah, the Anointed One. And that shows that in the biblical perspective, Darius was subject to the laws of God. And interestingly, in Persian culture, the idea was that the emperor was also subject to the laws. So maybe there was actually some biblical influence. Biblical prophets, right, influenced Persian thought specifically because, Isaiah talks about Darius. So then when we move to Greece, we have what we call classical culture. Greeks were known for their tragedies and their dramas. The tragedy, of course, being when the good guy suffers through no fault of his own. Comedies being when the bad guy loses and the good guy is vindicated. So it doesn't actually mean, comedy in the sense of Bill Cosby. Right? Do you understand? That's not what we're talking about. Not that kind of comedy. But even in the Greek tragedies, interestingly, it's still fate that governs all. Right? So the idea of humans having free will is ultimately just sort of mocked and laughed at. So with the Greeks, with classical culture, you have the rise of what we loosely term humanism, and this is the idea that man is the measure. This is ultimately embodied in the philosophy of the sophists, right? Pyrrhus and other skeptics and sophists. And the idea of the sophists was, as we said, that man is the measure, man is the fulcrum upon which everything turns, and everything is subjective and relative. It's just that simple. That's the ultimate expression of humanism. And so to find analogs in our day, well, that's pretty much the dominant view of the entire world right now, isn't it? Modernity being influenced by the ancient Greek notions that there's no metaphysics, there's only the individual's subjective opinions. And so 2 + 2 = 4, well, that's just your opinion, man. And the idea of like the humanist manifesto, right, from the UN, this kind of crap, this is the modern public version of this same ancient Greek idea of sophistry. So in the ancient Greek setting, tyranny and aristocracy were much more prevalent than democracy. Democracy is a later manifestation, a later phenomena amongst the Greeks. And of course, anybody who knows a little bit about this, they know that democracy amongst the Greeks was nothing like what we're told democracy in our day is. If you had to be a landowner, you had to be a male, you could own slaves and so forth and so on. That was the only way that you had a vote. So, roughly carried over into the Republican principles of the founding fathers, quote unquote, of America. Right? I mean, you had to if you paid taxes and you had land and you had slaves and so, then you could have and were a male, you could vote, white male in that case, right? So what people think is democracy, that everybody just by the mere fact of existing has some sort of high opinion of themselves and therefore is entitled to some sort of vote or something like this. This is completely foreign to all ancient notions of democracy, as well as modern, quote, democracy in terms of the founding fathers and republicanism. That's all now, as we know, weaponized psychological warfare in our day. But ancient Greek democracy bears no resemblance to these modern ideas. I'm not saying ancient Greek democracy is good. I'm just stating the fact that it wasn't what we think by the term, quote, democracy. So Greece's democracy, however, it's good to point out, as democracies always do, it fails. It doesn't work because democracy is stupid. It's preposterous. It's all based on the idea that everybody is equal, and they're not. Just by any measure that you want, like nature, talents, intelligence, gifts, beliefs, across the board, they're not equal. And so, in other words, what we see is that democracy goes along with sophistry and relativism, right? It goes along with the idea of all ideas being leveled, all ideas being equalized, none is better than the other. And if you say that anything else is the case, well, you're a racist. So, by the time, of course, of the Renaissance, we have this, in the West, you get this resurgence of the ancient ideas of humanism and Greek humanism and so forth. And it looks back to that period and tries to resurrect it, and of course that fails as well. So all of these humanistic endeavors fail because man himself doesn't really make sense or have any value outside of a larger worldview or context within which man and reality have value, right? So again, the secular approaches to all this just really collapse. As we move into the period of Rome, the next empire, Rome is, of course, known for its legalities, for its penal codes, its law, and its order, the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome throughout the empire. And along with this, we have, of course, the deification, the apotheosis of the emperor. Caesar is the incarnation, again, of God on earth, just like Pharaoh, and he demands the worship of all his citizens. And what's interesting about Caesar worship is Caesar didn't care if you had a bunch of other gods. You could have any of the state-approved gods just as long as you paid homage to Caesar. All right, so you can worship the stick god, you can worship the tree god, you can worship the Egyptian gods, you can worship the piss god if you want. It doesn't matter as long as you pay homage to Caesar as God. And so what ends up being the real God in that system is, of course, Caesar. Or the state. All right, statism. And again, what is the common theme across all the ancient cultures? Statism. Right? When you don't have the kind of God that we believe in, which is the basis of objective law and so forth in Revelation, 10 Commandments, etc., etc. When you don't have that, you get statism. So when God is rejected, the state becomes de facto God. It becomes the dominating incarnation of order, the ordering principle. And our philosophy has a different order, right? And there's a battle here between our view and the pagan view, because we do not advocate or admit to statism. And that's why it's such an amazing, miraculous phenomenon that the Roman Empire converted to our view, which limits the emperor. And if you know the history of the church for the first 1,000 years, for example, how many pagan emperors there were, for example, in the first 3 centuries before the conversion of the empire, who tried to stamp out Christianity. They weren't successful. And then with the conversion of the emperors, you eventually had many who were Orthodox and many who were heretics. And the heretic emperors tried as best they could to stamp out the church. And they couldn't do it. So, the fact that we believe the exact same thing as the church under the martyrs of the first 3 centuries, as well as the church under the fathers of the first 7, 8 centuries, right, shows I would say that we have the same faith. It's we differ in nothing in regard to what St. Athanasius taught, when he was dealing with heretical emperors, when he was dealing with heretical bishops, when he was dealing with pagans. Our view, if you read Athanasius's letters, if you read his Against Serapion, if you read his On the Incarnation and so forth, these classical works, we believe all the same things in our day. 2,000 years later, in my local Orthodox church, we believe all those same things. So that's a testament, I think, to the unity and the stability of one holy Catholic apostolic faith, right? So we want to move back then to the Greeks again and talk about the Greek poets. Greek poets spoke for the outlook of their day, you could say. We have Homer, who's around 850 BC, roughly. And Homer's about 120 years older than the prophet Isaiah, to set this in the context of the Old Testament. We look at the Iliad, which is an attempt to explain the woes of Greece and Greek history. And it stems from the pride and passions, Homer says, and the interference of the gods. Zeus is, of course, the chief deity within the henotheistic system. Zeus was, however, a created god. He came from Kronos. He came from time. So Kronos actually rules the gods in some bizarre, incoherent notion. And what we see is that every aspect of nature, even in this view, has its own God. So Zeus is not the omnipotent creator, right? And you can read Acts 17 again, where Paul talks about this kind of a perspective that he interacts with. Zeus is a kind of authority, a rough sort of middle grade authority, maybe a demiurge type character, but he's often harassed by his wife, right? Zeus is the subject of the fates, and sometimes he consults the scales to see what fate has determined, and yet at other times Zeus determines the fates. Zeus at times is dishonest, he's deceptive, and he's basically just a large projection of man, right? Or like some fallen leader, a Greek tyrant or something. That's really what Zeus is. And the biblical perspective of God is completely different. Zeus is he's not at all like Zeus. He is, if you know the attributes of God, we know that our God is completely different. Our God is sovereign. He's omnipotent, omnipresent. He is spirit. He's not jealous. He's not capricious. He doesn't have these anthropomorphic qualities that are ascribed to Zeus, even though the Bible in the Old Testament period does, in many cases, ascribe anthropomorphisms to God. We don't take those literally. God doesn't change his mind. And that was even understood by the prophets and Moses and so forth, right? So, again, this is just figurative language. If I say, we talk about the eyes of the Lord roam through the earth looking to see who, is righteous or something like this in the Psalms. Well, when David was writing that, he didn't literally think that God had two eyeballs flying around, looking around the earth, right? He understood that it's just figurative language, speaking to the people of that time. Now, so we ask the question, well, then why did the Greeks worship the gods? They weren't very respected. Why would you worship these deities that are kind of crappy? Like that? They're capricious, they're rude, they're mean, they're selfish, they're arrogant. Well, that's because they were as bad as man, right? So they were utilized for their, quote, powers, right? You could maybe supposedly tap into the gods and they could help you win a battle or something, or see the future if you took some kind of drug or something like that. If you remember the movie 300, I guess you kind of have a rough approximation of this told in, kind of comic book style. But, when he goes up on the mountain to talk to the prophetess, if I recall, she breathes in some kind of vapor and she starts tripping balls and she's out of her mind, possessed, right? Well, she's on some drug or something. And I've read scholarly treatments that actually think that there was something like this, like at the Oracle of Delphi, there might have actually been some kind of either some sort of seeping gas that they got high on, or just some narcotic or something like this. Because narcotics and drugs is ancient, right? It's shamanism. This goes back to the ancient world. So no, that's not a far out theory. But the idea here, of course, being that you could placate the gods, and the gods are kind of like a technology. Like if you give them a gift, then they'll do something for you. They'll kill your enemy or something. Right? And this survives even still in the notions of the veve of voodoo or the shamans, right? And the curses and so forth. So there was no concept of any kind of atonement or something like this, like we read about in the Bible, because there was no absolute morality. There's not an absolute morality when chaos reigns. And ultimately, even though we talk about Zeus, we talk about the gods, we talk about fate and all this kind of stuff, really in this position, it's just chaos is what's reigning here. And the Greeks even recognized that at times. They would have these rituals at times where they would celebrate chaos. And they would do orgies, and the women would put on beards, and the men would dress up like women. I'm not joking, by the way. And then they would have these sort of reenactments of chaos. I even cite that in my book, in the Eyes Wide Shut chapter, by the way. So nature here is, as we said, chaos. It's irregular, dominated by irregularity and chaos. And the gods are always screwing each other and having sex and banging each other and really just being unpredictable and exemplifying the fact that there is no moral order in the universe. The dictates of the gods are capricious, and they're just as irrational as tyrannical overlords. And we could see then why the state, the tyrants, the oligarchs could use these gods to their own advantage. Because, if you're stealing, I don't know, like you're taking the babes from other guys in your dominion. You take some guy's wife and, oh, I've appropriated your wife. She's mine now. Yeah, she's a hottie, but sorry, the gods have done it. The gods have told me that your wife's mine now. So this is just an old trick. So we don't see any consistency is what I'm trying to get at here. And so it's not logos, truly speaking. And in Plato, I think, recognized this chaos, and this is why he's critical and critiques the gods, is that there's nothing objective about this. It's just total chaos. And there's no real concept of any kind of moral law that's binding on man as a result of the gods being total douchebags. So the conclusion here, and this is why it's very distinct from something that we would believe, and actually what the prophets in the days of Homer, right, our prophets in the days of Homer and Plato and so forth, were actually already preaching this distinction, right? Athens versus Jerusalem, so to speak. Acts 17. So the conclusion here is that the deities of these religions manifested no omnipotence. They had no morality. They had no uniformity. There was no need for reconciliation or atonement or salvation. There's no basis for learning anything either about the religion or about the world, because it's just a repeating tradition of chaos and madness and so forth, right? I mean, you do have things like Apollo and Apollonian religion, which is supposed to be based on order, and this is probably, what influenced Plato to a great degree.
Let me show in a parable to what.
But I want to stress again that, you often hear this kind of zeitgeist idea or this notion of the total similarity. The biblical presentation and the Torah and then into the New Testament or whatever. It's just a confluence, a syncretism of ancient gods and so forth, and they're all the same. They bear all the same character. No, they don't, actually, because number one, we don't worship nature. Nature is created. That is completely distinct. None of the other views believe in creation ex nihilo. That is unique to our position, our religion. The deities in those other views are not omnipotent. They do not lay down a single moral code. There is no uniformity amongst the religious presentation and belief systems. There is no need for reconciliation or conception of overcoming the passions in those religions. There is no basis for learning the religion to live a holy life that leads to a bodily resurrection. Now, I understand that in Egypt there was a conception of resurrection, which is because the prophets were there, Abraham and Joseph, as I said before. But setting that aside, history, you see what I'm getting at with resurrection here is that history is confirmed as meaningful, and in these religions it's not, pretty much across the board. History has no significance other than to something that you need to escape from, right? Plato's allegory of the cave, as you see here in the hilarious cartoon imagery that you can find online that Orson Welles actually does the voiceover for. But in Homer, right, as we said, the people are supposed to learn by imitating the bard and his characters. So the oral tradition, the Homeric tradition, is something that is laid down by the bard. And Plato will actually come along to say that this is part of the problem of the cave. right? You need to be freed from the cave. You need to be let loose and come out and see the sun in its fullness in terms of objective truth, and understand that it's not these gods, right? And again, maybe Plato was influenced by Isaiah or something. Like, people have posited that theory. I wouldn't be surprised, given that there's these kind of rough analogies to biblical thought and Platonism. So the conclusion then of the ancient Greek period, classical period, is that all of Greece was pretty much taught by Homer, and there's no universal order that you could know by reason. And that's the key difference that our position has. Now, I'm not saying that our position, again, is all reason. It's not all rationalism, but it is rational, and it is the only rational position. Other figures that we can mention in the early 700s BC would be like Hesiod, and he's contemporary with Isaiah. He wrote the Theogony and Works and Days, and we still have here this sort of anthropomorphic cosmology. It's not much better than Homer. However, Hesiod has Zeus be a lot more noble and a lot more regular and predictable. Not regular in terms of his bowel movements, but a lot more predictable. He's characterized as the one who lifts up our spirits. Right? He brings the rule of law and justice. He loses his weakness in Hesiod. Fate here is no longer wild and predictable, but it actually becomes a lot more like something like karma in Hesiod. It's concerned with having needs and man is concerned with heaven now and the needs and feelings of heaven in Hesiod. For Hesiod, there's a moral, active, consistent outplay of fate. So fate takes on a little more coherent presentation. It's not as chaotic as perhaps in Homer. And man is not seen like the rest of nature in Hesiod, interestingly. He's more than just another animal. He's more than just another savage. Man should have self-control and moderation, we learn here. Right? So it's not just about the spirited virtues of heroic courage or something like that we get out of the Iliad or something, or the Odyssey. It's actually now more about self-control, moderation, controlling the passions, this kind of stuff. But we now begin to have a question or a notion relating to the question of universal order in nature. And is it moral? So nature here is still not opened up to human reason, of course, because ultimate reality is still subjected to the gods. So there's still a dialectical tension, we would say. And there is a pervasive moral nature, and man is part of it, but he's also not part of it in Hesiod, is the problem here, is that we get kind of a dual position that's unclear. Like the gods, however, there's still no common moral order across the board. 525 BC, we have Aeschylus, and this would be he's the author of the trilogy and the Orestia, and he's this famous plays. Here, the gods take on a new characteristic of being enlightening, and they have a benign influence in human affairs. The furies that are in man, right, have to be tamed. So we're moving more towards control, more towards self-control, sobriety, taming these damned furies. Now, the gods enlighten us by stopping these furies, actually, and so you could argue that it's an allegorical presentation of self-control. And what are the furies? Well, they just represent, as we said, this irrational, wild, savage side of man. So 495 BC, Sophocles, the Antigone. There's a great serenity and confidence in his works, I would say, because the world is, again, more and more ordered. So we get more order. Things are moving out of chaos and into order. man has a divine law over him here, we're starting to see. So tragedy comes to man through his defects, right? So the protagonist characters have these defects that are the source of the tragedy, right? It's not just the gods willing chaos upon him. Man actually has a kind of moral duty here, a moral responsibility. And man is expected to control his actions and not be ruled by the Furies and the Fates. So then we have this monumentous situation of the Peloponnesian War. And this was a big situation for the Greeks. This was 431 to 404 BC. Now, so the Peloponnesian War brought a lot of despair and a loss of confidence and chaos, and this is the milieu, the context from which Plato will seek to try to order things, right? He wants to stop the insanity, right? Like Susan Power or whatever her name was from the 90s. The war was between Athens and their democracy, and Sparta, the war military soldier rulers. So Sparta thought Athens was trying to kind of aristocracy in Sparta. And they thought Athens was trying to dominate because of their bad deals that were made with Corinth, and so Sparta assumed that they had to put an end to it. So one must be primary here. You can't have aristocracy or democracy. And so this war brought about this internal tension in Athens. Are we going to support democracy, or are we going to fight for against the aristocracy and so forth? And so democracy was not that great in a time of war, right? I mean, it doesn't make any sense to try to get everybody on board with the war effort if you are a egalitarian type democracy. Of course, again, they weren't really egalitarian, but you know what I mean. You're not worshiping or following soldiers and war heroes. Now, the Athenians were used to pretty barbarous tactics, and they actually butchered some of the delegates from Sparta, and this was considered, morally atrocious because of the view that it was bad publicity, bad, what do you call it? International relations, I guess you said, national relations, whatever you want to call it. So during this period, Aristophanes writes poems that are actually pretty cynical about democracy. And his view was a kind of sort of communistic approach, interestingly. 480 BC was the period of Euripides, and Euripides wrote about 50 years prior to the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War. He wrote Medea and Helen and the Trojan women. And he changed his mind about war and said that the moral order of nature itself was being violated, and it will bring about destruction. So he said that the gods ultimately were useless to help in these situations. They do exist, but they're pretty much irrelevant to man. They don't help you. So the war had destroyed a lot of this idealism, and maybe something comparable to the communist ideology prior to the outbreak of World War I and II, right? All this optimism of changing the moral, the social order and all this kind of stuff, and getting rid of hierarchy and instituting egalitarianism. And then you have World War I and World War II, and then this leads to total pessimism amongst, Frankfurt School Marxists and stuff, because none of their Marxist predictions actually came about. So egotism and passion had brought about this giant collapse of the order. So you have with Sophocles, for example, a lot of confidence, and then with Euripides, you have a lot of despair. So in both, you get the idea that salvation originates in man, right? There's a progressive move here away from the transcendent gods and to despair and hope in man. All right, so that you get this same process working its way out in history. Right, so the gods, then there's outbreak of war, despair in that, and the hope in man creating this, his utopian civilization on Earth. So the conclusion, I would say, of this period, this section, is that we now are striving for some kind of moral order, some kind of natural order out there, some kind of ruled system of thought as a result, perhaps, of all of the warfare that we've seen. So into the pre-Socratic period, then we have the Milesians, and the questions will rise that are more scientific, more rational in nature, more metaphysical in a classical sense. Thales, who is a monist, asked the question, what is reality? This is about 600 BC. And he says, well, it's one kind of substance. Right? So we have a move away from the gods into a question of metaphysics. Reality is ultimately summed up in one kind of thing that stands behind the physical phenomena of what we see, and it's all water. H2O, baby. That's the substance of everything, secretly in a mystical, behind the veil sense. Right? It's ultimately all just water. Now, we might propose that Thales thought this because he lived around a bunch of water. So a lot of plants and animals and humans, have water as an integral substance to their being, and they require water. So you could see why he might have proposed this theory that, well, maybe everything's just water. But what's interesting is that it's a movement towards abstraction, right? So we moved out of gods and into asking abstract questions of, well, what is the substance of what's out there? What makes up all of this stuff out there, all these objects in the world, the trees and the plants and the sticks, and Jazzy Jeff and Little Wayne? What makes them up? Well, it looks like it's some kind of substance, some kind of unifying thing. And so here we have the initial question of seeking a unifying principle. And his answer is that it's water. So also interestingly is that he has a question of epistemology. And for Thales, it's empirical. It's a kind of naturalistic scientific method. And if we ask the question, well, Thales, if everything is one thing, if it's all water, why do we have distinctions? Why are there different things if everything at base is one thing? And his response is what's called hylozoism. Hylozoism. And this is the idea that everything is full of God. And some say that this was a kind of mythical orientation, but he was probably more likely using this term, quote, God, just as a kind of generic force. So it's rather that, yeah, there is difference and there is distinction, but behind the difference and the distinction, there's one unifying God force of water. So I guess maybe Neptune. It's like everything is Neptune ultimately. I don't know, but the poets then, as we see, were a lot they're more crude, more brutal, brutish, and mythical in their approach. And Thales is the beginning of a more philosophical or scientific approach, we might call it, to be anachronistic. And he's very biased against supernaturalism. He's very skeptical of the gods and of supernatural approaches, and he wants a more rational, more naturalistic, scientific approach, right, to answer these kinds of questions. And so where is the solution to these problems? Well, it's not in religious writings. It's not in Homer. It's in examining the natural world. It's immanent in the world itself. The meanings that we want, that we seek to find, are immanentistic. So in a way, he kind of anticipates Aristotle here. He's the Aristotle before Aristotle, you could say. next we could move, but ultimately it's monistic. We should point out everything's one, and Plato falls back into monism too, by the way. Anaximander comes along right thereafter, or is contemporary with Thales, and he cross-examines Thales, and he says, no, not everything is water. Rocks are not water. They're solid. Why would you say everything is water when you're saying that we learn these things empirically, and when I empirically go check out the rocks, they are pretty much not like water at all. So this doesn't make any sense, he says. So sand is not water, right? And rocks and sand don't have water. They don't possess water as a quality, as Thales attempted to argue. So out with that, and if everything is water, Thales says, then non-water is water, and that's a contradiction. So anyone who chooses any particular will have the logical problem of things that are not that thing. So if you say everything is fire, right, you have this logical problem in your worldview of, well, but in your experience, there are things that are not fire. So how is everything that thing if some things in your experience, which is what you based your claim of everything being fire on, if some things are not fire, right? And this is, again, a recurring problem in philosophy across the board. If you stress the many, right, which is what's going to happen here, then you have the dialectical problem of that the monist was trying to answer in a different vantage point is what I'm trying to say. So for Anaximander, the underlying stuff of reality is the aperon. A-E-P-E-I-R-O-N, aperon, the Greek term for boundless, the beyond. And so that which is beyond the physical has no boundaries. So it's another kind of monism, but this is really just an anticipation of the idea that all reality is energy. So it's not any particular thing of all reality is ultimately water, fire, whatever. It's boundless energy or force, perhaps. The aperon. And the reason he says this is that Anaximander is not a empiricist. He's more on the rationalist side, more on the Plato side. He says, no, you're not going to get a unifying principle by empiricism, just by the very nature of the fact that your empirical experience is limited. So you need something that comes from a different realm, the ideal realm, right, to unify the objective external world. So for him, there is knowledge that's independent of observation. And the boundless, the aperon, actually could not be observed, right? And that's true. You don't observe aperon or the boundlessness. So, but when it comes to questions of, well, what is man? What is the self? Well, for him, it's determinism. We're back to determinism again. Everything is just endless series of events. Ultimately, the aperon, I guess you could say, just determines everything. And there's no laws. There's no real moral order here. We're just bound by the force of the mechanistic aperon, the universe. All events are predictable, ultimately. And so it's a kind of behaviorist type view with Anaximander. He does want to say, that man makes choices, we do make decisions, but he says ultimately in the big scale picture, it's all determined. Right? There are factors that are it's just that, unfortunately, that way. And Anaximander is also an evolutionist, believe it or not. He believes that men evolved from fish. So, sorry, Darwin. Your mythology was preceded a long time ago. In fact, Darwin probably just ripped this off of Anaximander. And so if we were to, by the way, which shows that evolutionary theory is not empirical. It's based on these kind of supra-empirical theories, metaphysical theories, mythical theories. Now, if all of reality is aperon, it's the boundless, then again the question arises for the monist, how do we get diversity? Why do we have many different things? How do we get particularity? The boundless, the aperon, is a giant sort of blender. So the answer is that, well, it is a blender, right? It is a mixing bowl, Anaximander says. There's a bowl with water in it, and there's a kind of circular swirling motion that happens. And when it gets too frisky, some of the mixing material sort of sloshes out of the bowl. And this is like the analogy, I'm not joking. And this is chance. When chance appears, however, it still is a determined necessity. So some things grow and develop out of the chance, right? Big Bang, lightning strikes the primordial goo, right? This is all out of Anaximander. And so this is just Darwinism, right? He speculates that man evolved from the fish, and he holds to the transmigration of souls like Plato. And this is just ancient Hindu thought, ancient Egyptian thought, really. Again, nothing new under the sun. So the cosmic matter that creates itself disintegrates and recreates itself. So ultimately, we're just back to mythology under the guise of what we thought was more, quote, scientific, right? And it has the appearance of at least being more scientific. Oh, we're going to get rid of all these dumb gods and move in a more rational perspective. And what do we fall back on? Matter becomes the god, quote unquote. Matter, the aperon, the boundless, becomes the new metaphysical God principle that is just made meaningless, right? I mean, again, this is just gobbledygook. So much for Anaximander. However, again, Anaximander he presages Darwin, which is pretty phenomenal, actually. Next, we come to Anaximenes, and this is 588 BC, roughly, to 526 BC. Now, he disagrees with Anaximander, and he says, well, what is this aperon that you're talking about? You talk about the aperon as a thing. The boundless is a thing. You're identifying it. And that would mean that it's a particular. So how can you talk about the boundless, the beyond, the aperon, as if it was a thing, a positive cataphatic statement, when you're telling us that it's also apophatic? Right? So it doesn't make sense. So it's not. It can't be boundless and a particular thing at the same time. It's a thing, but it's thingless, you're saying. And according to Anaximenes, this is a contradiction. So you can't have a thing that is not a particular thing. So what then unifies everything? Anaximenes says, well, this time it's something different. It's called air. So air is everything. All is air. Air can be heavy. It can be light. It can change. It can morph into water. You know, it could do all this kind of different stuff. You can have gases and stuff, right? The different modes of matter. And this is the best explanation for what everything is. So bodies are just air that's heavy, right? Solid bodies are air that's heavy. Clouds are air that's lighter, but still has some perhaps physicality to them. And then air is just itself that we breathe is just the lightest version of reality. Right? So we're still back. This is the chain of being idea, right? Rocks have the most being, right? And or excuse me, the heaviest being, and they sort of fall down to the earth because they tend towards non-being. In the chain of being, the best being, we should say, is being that is most like thought, that is most like air. So really what Anaximenes, and I'll get all these Greek names mixed up, what Anaximenes is doing here is kind of laying forth the Greek chain of being for us and just smashing it into something in the physical world, and he's using air, right? So it's not fire, it's not water, it's air this time. Now, like modern science, it's reductionist, right? He wants to reduce all of reality to some primary chemical, some quantitative difference, some quantum. Particularity is accounted for in this because it's just air in different forms, right? So how do we, everything is air, but how do we get different stuff? Well, it's air in different configurations, heavier air and lighter air. Now, if everything is air, the question is, how does it become something else? How does it become water? And what is water if everything is air? So we haven't really escaped the problems that we've had in Thales and Anaximander. We've just sort of restated the problem in a different form. And this is where we move into the period 580 BC, 497 BC-ish, roughly, flourishing around 525 BC of the Pythagoreans. So what are we going to get with the Pythagoreans? Well, we're going to get uniformity in nature and the mystical approach to numbers. Right, we're going to have 3 Eleatic questions: unity versus diversity, empiricism versus rationalism, and motion and change and becoming versus stasis. Right, new dialectical questions are going to be asked and will arise here based on standing on the shoulders of the foolishness that came before. Now, Pythagoreanism is a lot better because these other guys, you know, I mean, they're pretty bad. But at least we're going to get more of a movement towards the transcendent with the Pythagoreans, given they're going to start asking math theory questions. They're going to be saying, no, wait a minute, we're talking about numbers. And now you've been saying everything's air. You've been saying everything's apeiron, all these other guys. Well, we're talking about 1s and 2s and 3s and 7s and these theories and theorems and geometry. Now, what are these things? What are these abstract qualities or objects? Or what is pi, right? What is that? I'm not saying what does it do when we tabulate it on a piece of paper and, you know, build a bridge or something, or build an ionic column. I'm asking, what is the number itself, number theory, right? So that will be where we move next as we get into Plato, but that's going to conclude to this week's talk. So before we get into Pythagoras and more Plato, next week we're going to do, as we said, we'll do Pythagoreans, Heraclitus, all his flux, Xenophanes, Parmenides, Zeno, Empedocles, Anaxagoras, and then the atomists.